Please join me in giving a very warm welcome to our keynote speaker this evening, Lord Deben.
Well, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I thought it was very clever to have the dinner, given that it's on behalf of Southface, which is very concerned about building, to have the dinner in a place where you have to walk through a building site to get to it. It's a remarkable achievement to have done that, but what a good place for us to meet. I do believe that we're living in the most exciting moment of time for the last 500 years. I just think everybody here ought to be immensely grateful to be living now and not at any other time, because this is the moment in which human beings are beginning to look at each other in a wholly different way. Very often people talk about things like climate change as being frightening, as being expensive, as being dangerous. I just want you to think of it as the moment in which human beings realise that there is no way forward unless we actually do things together. The whole of history is about imperialism. The whole of history is about one village beating up the next door village in order to get control of their lands, of their fishing rights, of their ability to get animals, and then of cities, and then of countries, and increasingly of great groups, determined always to dominate other people in order to be able to control resources and to maintain their own lifestyles. And I believe we're now moving into a world in which we recognise that we will solve none of our problems unless we do it together. It's very hard. It's very hard. But I think I have a right to say this because I come as the representative of one island state to another. You're just a bigger island. and the United States, like the United Kingdom, has this huge problem of feeling that somehow or other we ought to be able to get the whole of the rest of the world to think like us. Globalization for a long time was thought by Americans to be a mechanism by which American business and American attitudes would be spread throughout the world. They suddenly discovered that it wasn't like that. The rest of the world had a say as well. And of course that is upsetting to some people. But to me it's the most wonderful opportunity, because this is the moment in which we realise that our future is a common future, and if we work together we can produce that common future in peace and harmony, and if we don't, there is no common future. That is what climate change says. If we don't do it together, there is no together to do it. That is where we are, and what an exciting moment it is. It's 500 years since the Renaissance gave us a real change in human beings' way of looking at each other. And we are the generations that have to deal with it today. And the reason I'm particularly pleased to be here in Atlanta, and especially since hearing your mayor give his address, is because it is crucially important for the rest of the world that great cities in the United States, like Atlanta, do the things you're doing. What I'm about to say may upset some, but I don't think Americans recognise the real anger in the rest of the world, that whereas we in Britain, in Europe, in China, in India, are beginning to do what we need to do about climate change, the thing is going backwards, or appears to be here. You have 4% of the world's population, you produce 25% of the world's emissions. You are changing my climate. And that's why the rest of the world feels very strongly about the need for the United States to join in this world campaign to save the planet. And your friends in the rest of the world, like the British, and particularly like British Conservatives, we want you, we need you, and in Atlanta we found you. So thank you for all that you're doing here, and please help others to understand that what is happening here ought to be the example to the rest of America, and that is crucial for the whole of the world. The idea that you can reduce your water consumption by 17.5% and your energy consumption by 12.5%, why is it that so many national politicians in the United States think that combating climate change is a cost? It isn't a cost. It's a proper commercial deal. You make money by doing things in a sustainable way. That is the curious oddity of this great nation, that you have not, outside cities which set an example like this, you have not been able to understand that the reason we do it in Britain is because we recognise that the future is there. We have to do it, of course, because we care about our children and our grandchildren. But we have turned it, even in these tough economic times, we have turned it into an income earner. You know, the best definition of sustainability I know is doing more with less. Is there a better definition of profit than that? Every business represented here knows very well that if you do more with less, the bottom line grows. And what are we doing? Wasting money on energy we do not need to use. What are we doing? Wasting money on water we do not need to use. I want that in my own pocket. That's why I'm a conservative. That's why I believe in the profit motive. That's why I believe in the capitalist society. And what really upsets me is that I am being betrayed by people who claim to be capitalists, who claim to be conservatives, and who don't understand that wastage is not a conservative activity. I don't want to give money to the utilities. I want to keep it myself. Discovered in Britain that the big problem about sustainable building was that you were competing one-offs against the bulk product. And we discovered that if everybody built sustainable buildings rather than unsustainable buildings, there wasn't much difference in the price. The difference came because if Mr. Smith was a decent, honourable man who wanted to have a sustainable building, he'd be a one-off. So he paid 30 or 40% more because everything had to be made for him. Nothing could be mass-produced. And that's why when we produced our quality of life report for David Cameron, the Prime Minister now of Britain, who was then the leader of the opposition, we said you've actually got to mandate these standards. Not because we like mandating things, we are a free enterprise party, but because unless everybody does it, then the price is too high for anybody to do it. And what has happened in Britain is that as Jeff Seabright said, but by 2016, every new house has got to meet what we call Eco Standard 6. And that means it has to be zero carbon. And the effect, of course, has been wonderful. First of all the people in the building industry hated it. They were very rude, they campaigned against it, they paid dollars to stop it, they argued that the Conservative Party should never do this, they were supposed to be business friendly, and we said that's why we're doing it. We had all those rows, and now, of course, they're all doing it. And they're vying with each other as to who can get there first. And those who are stupid enough to think that we might change the rules are going to be out of business. That's where they should be. And the reality is that we're now making capitalism work in favour of sustainability. Capitalism is the only way we will deliver this. Just think of the Coca-Cola company for a moment. Last year they announced the plant bottle. It will be a bottle which starts a revolution, made out of renewables. It comes from sugarcane and the wastage from sugarcane. It's only 30% of that at the moment, but this is an incremental story. Having started, we will reach a stage in which, at least in this area, we are entirely renewable. The Coca-Cola company wouldn't have done that if they were not a competitive business who wanted to be there first, who could see how the world was changing, who could put themselves where you needed to be for the new world. And if you watch their competitors, they're all scrabbling to be there as well. And of course that means they will be, and I'm happy about that. But the issue is, we have to use the mechanisms of capitalism to deliver the biggest change in our society that we have ever needed as quickly as it has to be done. Now, one of the things I found going here, and indeed into Australia, where I've just come from, is that every society sort of thinks that they're the only people being asked to do it. So I hope you won't mind if I just say what is happening in the European Union. All the countries in the European Union are committed to a reduction in their emissions by 80% by the year 2050. All the countries in the European Union are committed to a 20% reduction by 2020. Some of the countries in the European Union, and Britain is one of them, are going to cut our emissions by 30% by the year 2020. And we are absolutely on target for that. We're going to do it because we know that unless we keep the increase in the temperature in the world below a 2-degree increase, then it will mean that all sorts of things which we think are important will not be possible. In Britain, for example, in the last 35 years, I have lived in the same place. I'm so lucky to be stable. And in our peculiar climate, let me tell you two things that have happened in Suffolk in those 35 years. The first is that spring is 10 days earlier. Don't tell me climate change isn't happening. Every countryman in Britain knows it's happening. And the second thing is this. 30 years ago, I met a farmer who came from Holland. He was planting apple trees. We are a big apple producer. I said to him, why have you come here? He said, well, the reality is that this is the one place where I can get the mix I need in terms of heat and sun, and I don't need to irrigate. Now, for various reasons, because my constituency was redrawn, I didn't meet him again for 30 years. And he then told me that in those 30 years, he'd started with no irrigation, He'd moved to some irrigation. He'd moved to more irrigation. He'd finally reached an irrigation level which was the maximum he could have from his permit. And now he was using Israeli trickle irrigation in order to produce the apples. In 30 years, that part of Britain has moved from being absolutely self-sufficient in water to being a semi-arid area. We now are officially classified as a semi-arid area. Now that's not true of the whole of Britain, and of course it's different elsewhere. But in our area, that's what happened to us. So when people talk about climate change not happening, and it hasn't been proved, and people don't know, and what about what, I just say to you, we know. And we know that unless we do something about it, it will in fact engulf us. Knowledge is a terrifying thing. I am quite old now. I admit to that because it's in all the reference books, so I can't pretend. But the older I get, the more I appreciate the first few chapters of Genesis. Because that fundamental myth, that knowledge changes everything, is a crucial one for all of us. Once you know, you can't stay in the garden. Once you know, you have to become responsible in a way you weren't before. Now, Jeff was kind enough to refer to my son. It's a great pride if you're a father who spent 35 years in Parliament to then go into the House of Lords and find that your eldest son has won a seat from the opposition and is a member of Parliament himself. But more important than that, he's written a book on the Black Death, the terrible disease which spread throughout Europe and killed half the population in many places, and certainly in every place, 1 in 3. And while I was doing research on climate change, like any father, I was the recipient of each chapter as it came off the computer. And therefore, these two things came together in my mind. And the thing that really struck me was, here were these people shocked by the most terrible, terrible disaster, and they didn't understand it. Indeed, so far did they not understand it, they did exactly the wrong things. The church, which was triumphant during this period, I mean, if you really want to understand what it was like to put your life on the line, you just have to read the accounts of the priests going around being absolutely unconcerned about their own health among those who were dying. But he'd asked everybody to go on pilgrimages, everybody to crowd into churches, everybody to give the disease to everybody else. They got it all wrong. And then I thought to myself, climate change, we know, but we deny. We know because we think that it's too tough, too difficult. And yet it's actually the key to the future. In 2050, there will be 9 billion people on this planet instead of the 6 billion people we have now. We cannot feed, clothe and house them if we go on using our resources at the speed we're doing now. So don't bother about climate change. We're going to have to do this now. We're going to have to do more with less. We're going to have to reduce our energy use. We're going to have to reduce our use of water. Because if we don't, we can't feed the next generation. And just think of the power of television. Do you really think that in 2020, 2025, when Bangladesh will be largely underwater, we are going to be able merely to laugh off 145 million people wandering about the countryside trying to find somewhere to settle. That's a question for those who think immigration is a problem in the United States. This is the biggest changing element in our future, and we know about it now. Isn't that exciting? Instead of being miserable about it, we don't have to be like the Middle Ages, when you're suddenly struck by a plague which you don't understand, you can't deal with it, and everything you do is wrong. We actually know, so we can do it. And if Sarah Palin is hearing, let me say it again, we can do it. And if you care about faith and flag, as I do, then that's why you have to fight this battle. That's what it's about. It's about ensuring stability for the nations of the earth. And no one should be more interested in stability than those of us who are lucky enough to have it. Whatever your views about what's happening in the Middle East today, one thing all of us here have to be grateful for is that we don't live in an area where people have no freedom to speak, no freedom to think, no freedom to choose, no freedom of any kind at all, and are at the mercy, in many cases, of people who would, in America, be certifiable. That's what we're facing, and we are lucky enough not to be in that position. Although some politicians, I know, in democratic countries, are certainly close to the certifiability bit. But aren't we lucky? Fortunate, blessed. I prefer blessed. Because I do believe that we have not done anything to make this world, we've received it. Mrs. Thatcher, who no one can claim was a left-wing pushover, Mrs. Thatcher was the first serious international politician to believe in climate change. She did so because she was a scientist by training. And I watched her pin the scientists against the wall and argue with them and fight them because she didn't want to believe in it, because it's very inconvenient. And she had to come to the terms of saying they're right. And that's why Britain was the first country in the world to take all this seriously. I just want to say to people who constantly in the United States praise Mrs. Thatcher, and rightly. I was her chairman of the party, I wrote many of her speeches, I love her, she was a wonderful woman. But remember, she thought that climate change was so important that she was the one who convinced George Bush to go to Rio. 20 years ago, she did that. So, I want just to say this to you in ending. Atlanta is terribly important because unless communities like yours, who understand what we're about, who can take responsibility for the facts that we know. And by the way, if you live next door to a downtown, let me just give you 3 things to say about climate change. First is very simple. If you go down into the ice for 400,000 years, it's the same as cutting down a tree and counting the rings. We can go back 400,000 years and more. in those 400,000 years, you can tell by the thickness of the ice about the temperature. And you can tell from the little globules in the ice about how much carbon there was. And there's just one very simple statement. At no time, no period, no circumstance, in the last 400,000 years has the temperature risen so far and so fast as in the last 150 years. And at no time has the carbon concentration been so great. So people who say, oh, well, it got rather hot in the medieval period. The Romans, oh, they grew vines on Hadrian's wall. That's like that. This is like that. The difference is that there are, of course, rises and falls in temperature, but we're talking about something which is non-analogous. No historical example. And anybody who thinks that you ignore that probably doesn't buy fire insurance. And the second thing I say to you is this. However bad you were at science at school, you will remember that the world was once too hot for any living thing. And gradually, because of the emergence of lichen and then of bushes and then of trees, the carbon was pulled out of the world and the atmosphere. And it was laid down. And as a result, first reptiles, well, first fish and then reptiles and then mammals and then human beings were able to emerge. Over the last 200 years, we have been reversing that process. We have been putting back into the atmosphere the very thing which made it impossible for us to live in the first place. And if people say, oh, you've got to prove that, I say to you, how is it that in this issue, unlike any other, you, us, most people in this room, have got to prove that it's dangerous to pour alien gases into the atmosphere. And the people who are doing it have got not to prove that it's safe. Can you imagine saying to a pharma company, oh, you can put anything onto the market, of course you can have any kind of medicine, you're perfectly happy. Somebody will have to prove that it's dangerous before we stop it. Can you imagine any other circumstance in life in which the people who are doing these things can do it until someone else can prove that it's dangerous? It's a mad world we've got into. So the second thing is just remember your history. We took the carbon out, that meant that human beings could live here. We're putting the carbon back in. Would it be surprising that that means that human beings can't live here? And the last of these things is a very important one. We spend more money and more time and more effort on one science than any other. It's the science of astronomy. We've looked at and investigated more millions of worlds than one can imagine. And the latest scientific view confirms what many people have said before, and that is that there is something apparently unique about this world. No one has yet been able to identify, although they have looked incredibly hard, any other world that can maintain life as we know it. Can we not understand that that means that this world is precious? That is what virtual uniqueness means. And if it's precious, it's probably quite hard to deliver the atmosphere in which we can all live. And might it not be that the word fragile is the word that we should use? In every other circumstance, we would say that we should care care for this world. That great medieval mystic, who wouldn't have understood anything that we say today, understood that better than anyone else. Dame Julian of Norwich talks about the world as a nut held in the hand of God. Now, you don't need to join me in believing in God, but what she meant was that it had to be cared for, that it had to be looked after. And all of us, religious or not religious, have to realise that the looking after is our job, either as the stewards of the Creator or just as the stewards. If we don't look after it, there is no future for our children or our grandchildren. And the reason that you matter in the whole world context, is that we need you to give us hope that this, the most powerful nation on earth, will one day take its proper role in helping to protect the planet and save the earth. We need you. We need you in a way which you cannot understand. And we need you too to recover the reputation of the United States. I want people to care for you, and I want people to be your friends. And you here can help to begin that process. And so, thank you for asking me tonight. My vision for this visionary dinner is that everybody here will recognise that what they do to make Atlanta a more sustainable, a more carbon-free, a more seriously strong opponent of climate change, every single thing you do is not only important for Atlanta, for Georgia, for the United States, but for the whole world. And we rely on you. So go to it.